is absolutely wild as Vern Gagne's all-star wrestling goes coast to coast and continent to continent. The greatest wrestlers in the world.
He may be an apprentice carpenter, but I guarantee you he is a seasoned ring veteran.
I've been hit with bar stools, bar rags, barmaids.
I'm talking to you.
They're scared that Hulkamania's still running wild. Oh, yeah. I got a big fat wife and 9 kids at home, and I gotta feed them.
And take a look at Jesse the Body in real life.
Open your hand once if you would.
You want to see it?
This is absolutely unbelievable. Totally, completely out of control.
He's coming in over the top. Hey! Look out!
What's going on, Mickheads? This is the #1 podcast dedicated to telling the stories and reliving the memories of the American Wrestling Association. I am the guy with the glare on the glasses. My name is Chris Tubbs. There's nothing I can do about it because I'm upstairs in my wife's office because I've been banished to the upstairs, which I guess is good. These guys are banished to, well, I don't know where you guys are at, but I assume... See, Mick, you don't have your glasses on. You don't. Do you wear glasses, by the way? I didn't even know.
Oh, my God, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That shows you how much I pay attention. Oh, and Joe's Mr. La-di-da there.
Oh, there he is. Yeah, he's
hoity-toity Polish Joe.
He's in the Heenan Beverly Hills penthouse.
I got to go and play my piano. I am the piano man.
Sing us a song, you're a Polish Joe.
Yeah, and I'm just hoping the blaster doesn't interrupt the podcast now.
God.
As long as you don't go orgasmic, then we're okay.
No guarantees on that, but we'll see what we can do.
That's
Didn't
a great
take
clip.
long. Didn't take long, guys.
See, if I was at work, that would have been the perfect liner. Don't go orgasmic. No guarantees.
No guarantees.
AWA Unleashed. Guys,
things are going well, and we got a good show. People love when we do a spotlight year, and that's what we're doing today.
Yeah, we are going to spotlight the year 1970.
Yeah, and being back on track helps after being a little delayed last week. So again, thank you for the patience and understanding. Life happens, surprisingly, sometimes.
Yes, Joe. That's very well said. And now hopefully things start to stabilize here. So that being said, if you're one of those people that doesn't like to listen to the promotional gimmick, go ahead and fast forward to about the 5 minute and 13 second mark, coming down in 3, 2, and 1. First of all, we do want you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Rate, review, leave a comment as well, because that always helps us with the algorithm. As I've been told, the YouTube overlords, they like it when you do that. And we like it too, but mostly for YouTube. We'd like to hear, even if you don't leave us a good comment, just leave a comment. You can say whatever you want, good, bad, otherwise, just leave a comment. But if you're not into the YouTube thing, which I highly do recommend, because a lot of our shows have a lot of visuals that go along with it. We're on Apple Podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, Google. Well, maybe not Google anymore, but Amazon. Just search AWA Unleashed and you'll find us. I mean, we're the only AWA Unleashed out there as of right now. So we've got that. Are we good with that first promotional piece, you guys?
Right there, buddy.
Works for me.
Okay. Second, we do have a new line of AWA Unleashed merchandise. You can tell right here, it's the Slick Mick Cup. I do have the AWA Unleashed t-shirt. I'm just too lazy to get off my ass and show you the entire thing, but you know what the logo is, so I think you guys will understand. Go get your Slick Mick merchandise. Get your AWA Unleashed merchandise. We've got coffee cups. We've got phone cases. We've got mouse pads. Just a lot of fun things to help support the podcast as well. I do have, I am, once things settle down, going to do It's a Raining in Miami concept and a Mickheads concept. Those are the two that I do have that are floating around in my little humanoid brain. So is there anything else that you guys would want to see? I mean, is there anything that would be fun that you guys, if I put the work into it to make it, would you guys be interested in purchasing it? Anything. So let me know, because I will do my best to design something. You guys have any requests right there? Or are you going to let me? Go full bore with this?
I'm going to let you go full bore, because you are the single reason why Joe and I are in money heaven right now. We are just, my mailman, when he brings those residual checks, the guy is hunchback right now.
Do we have different mailmen? Just, but having said that, Chris, you have added. I'm easy. Just ask my wife.
All right. Well, Mick's got a mailman, Mick, and Joe, you've got a milkman. Ask your wife. Okay. So anyway, shout out Jake Milliman, by the way. I'm not saying Jake Milliman's banging your wife, but I'm just saying that. Okay.
Wow. That's rails left.
Oh God. This is it. This is the total tank right here.
Boy, talk about turkey on a pole. Okay, I'll stop.
Oh boy.
Okay. You know what? It's good. It's after everything that's been going on. Personally, it's good to laugh. And finally, here, guys, a big thing that we do is the pinfall membership, $4.99 a month. We think it's well worth it. You get the podcast a day early. You get our watch alongs. You get our live chats. You get a letter and a magnet and just kind of a welcome from me. You get a 5-pack of pictures from Mick. So you do get a whole bunch of things. Plus, again, it's a fun way for us to be able to continue to add content. And, now that we're kind of hopefully back on track, we can kind of really start to schedule out some of those Patreon, because we did have things scheduled, but we had to reschedule and whatnot. So, okay, well, I screwed up the promotion because I went 2 minutes long, but you know what? It's our show. We got 53 minutes to talk about 1970. Anything else before we get into it, guys? And sorry about, all of that goofiness. That was inappropriate, but it was just fun.
Hold on. You're apologizing for goofiness and inappropriateness. Have you not seen this podcast before?
No, I never watch it.
Okay. I just wanted to check. Have to ask.
Yeah, I record it, and once I record it, it's like, it's gone.
You're not alone.
That's the best way to take in our show.
1970.
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna put that little banner. I'm gonna put the little banner gimmick on there. And by the way, at work, when I say gimmick, people are like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, you know what? If you have to ask, then you really don't need to know the answer. Let's first of all, guys. I'm going to start this, and then I'm going to kind of let you guys go, because I'm going to put the pictures up there. But we always talk about the AWA schedule, the cities, the attendance. Mick, why don't you go ahead and kind of kick it off, and then I'll let you guys kind of go through the conversation, and then I will pop in periodically, and then finish it up with the last question, number 9.
Sounds good. 1970, in terms of attendance and schedule, the AWA was a busy promotion. They had not yet gone to like the St. Paul Civic Center for bigger attendances, but around the horn, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 was pretty consistent. Milwaukee, Chicago, Omaha, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Winnipeg, Denver. That was pretty much the circuit. As I was looking over my results, I did not see any Green Bay results. So I'm guessing that Green Bay probably was about a year later or so before that became part of the regular AWA touring gimmick. But if that's not the case, if somebody's out there in the Wisconsin area knows otherwise, but those were your big mainstay cities. And also in 1970, the AWA really made a foray into Japan. And a lot of it played out in terms of somebody coming over here from Japan to challenge Vern Gagne. So early on, the AWA was already making their foray into the land of the rising sun. And all in all, it was a very, very good year for the AWA.
Well, and there's a very good reason why the AWA was not going to the Civic Center yet, because the Civic Center didn't exist.
Didn't exist. That's right.
I believe it was 1975 or 6 was the first year.
I think it was earlier.
Earlier
I
than
would
that?
get 73, 74.
Okay, we'll have to look into that one. But the AWA primarily, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Mick, the Minneapolis Auditorium, if I'm going by memory, was like the main venue. If you had 12 shows a year, I'd go 8 shows at the Minneapolis Auditorium and 4 at the St. Paul Auditorium.
That sounds about right. Yeah, and it was a regular deal, and it was a monthly show.
Mhm.
And as I said, all those other cities, if you look up AWA results, they were on the road constantly. I mean, I not necessarily the amount of time that they would be today going from cities to city, double shots or whatever, but they were consistent and they were doing extremely well. And the interesting thing about it, Joe, and we'll get to it in just a second, is that this was done. They had a banner year on the basis of feuds, not necessarily championship changes. So you didn't have to have that revolving door of champions in order to do well at the box office.
Well, let's get right into that. So who was the AWA champ in 1970?
I know this is going to be hard for you to believe. But the AWA champion in 1970 was that guy right there, and that is Vern Gagne. And Vern was starting to slow down, and it's interesting, you say the guy's starting to slow down 11 years before his first retirement, but Vern was not defending the championship a lot, at least in the United States. I think at one point, maybe 71, 72, I counted maybe 10, 12 championship defenses for Vern around the horn. But he was the champion throughout 1970 and beyond. As we know, he held the title for a long, long time. So, yeah, Vern was your singles champion in the AWA.
Well, let's stick with the whole championship theme. How about the tag team champs?
Tag team champs were as tough as it got. And again, there was no championship change. These were the guys that took the championship into the year 1970. Butcher Vachon and Mad Dog Vachon, and they held the title throughout the year. They did not lose the AWA Tag Team Championship until 1971. But, that's for another show. But for the duration of 1970, the Dog and the Butcher were your tag team champions.
So we've discussed it many times before. The Chicago territory, in particular, the Wild, Bob Luce, shall we say? Let's go into what was Bob Luce. How close was he working with the AWA versus sort of going off and doing his own thing?
He was working with the AWA for the big matches, for the main event matches. He would work with the WWA, Dick the Bruiser and so on and so forth. And then in the Indiana territory, that was Big Moose Cholak, by the way. We're just going to put up some of the talent that would pad the Chicago cards. They were regulars in Chicago going back a long, long time. And because of that, Bob Luce kind of carried him over, even though he had this working relationship with the AWA. There's Wilbur Snyder. At one time, Wilbur was called the most scientific wrestler in the world, even above and beyond Vern Gagne. And Wilbur, of course, and Dick the Bruiser worked some promotional stuff together, but Wilbur was another mainstay in the Chicago area. The reason we're focusing on Chicago is because with Chicago and Omaha, and we'll talk about this gentleman in just a moment, they were really the only AWA cities that kind of deviated from the norm in terms of the talent that would regularly appear on their show. That is Paul Christie, Golden Boy Paul Christie. When he started in the AWA in the early 60s, he was a babyface. He turned into a notorious heel managed by his wife, Bunny Love, who incidentally is going to be a guest on our AWA Unleashed podcast sometime in the next month or so. Looking forward to that. But Paul, again, another mainstay in the Chicago and Indiana area, kind of offshooting the AWA.
I can't help but think of Vern Gagne as the champ at the time, and I sort of expanded it from there.
Ernie Ladd,
the big cat,
the big kid. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
So I back to the Vern thing. The being world champion at that time versus the world champions of today. Is it fair to say that like Vern was understated? I mean, in terms of he wasn't an over the top hyperbolic baby face. He wasn't take your vitamins, say your prayers type of a guy. He was just somebody that you'd sit at a bar with and have a beer and just come across that way. I mean, of course, the French blood came up, but as far as like the promos go, it's just pretty even keel and straightforward.
Vern was first and foremost, Joe, a wrestler.
Yes.
And that was, he was more wrestler than character. And it was very important for Vern, we've talked about this many times, to maintain the credibility of professional wrestling as legitimate sport. Did he have his guys on his roster that were over the top? Of course he did. Crusher, Mad Dog, Vachon, Dr. X, whatever the Pompero Furpos of the world, the characters, but Vern was not one of those guys. And, you talked about it, and I mentioned earlier, Vern's infrequent title defenses going into 1970. The flip side of, we don't get to see Vern Gagne very much is that you didn't get to see Vern Gagne very much, and it was special. Mm-hmm. When Vern would defend a championship, they would have a build-up with whatever heel of the month of the year was at the time, chasing Vern Gagne. And it was also special in the sense that when Vern would wrestle and defend the title, at least in the Twin Cities, they jacked up the ticket prices, which is really interesting. It might have been only $1 or $2, but they would call it championship prices because Vern was on the show. Now, I'm guessing that didn't translate into money in somebody else's pocket other than Vern's for the couple extra bucks on the ticket price. But when Vern was champion, it was really a special deal. And again, Vern's personality, basically even keel. He was an all-American boy, and he was a wrestler. So
let's talk about some of those main event guys of 1970. The first picture, I hope that we're going to call up here. A couple of guys who did pretty well for themselves in the industry. Not seeing here comes the Wheel of Doom.
There we go. That is Billy Red Lyons and Red Bastien. And Billy Red Lyons, who feuded with Dr. X for quite some time in the Twin Cities, as did Red Bastien across the AWA. Billy Red Lyons was the real-life brother-in-law of Dr. X. And amazingly, he didn't know who he was under the mask. Apparently, they didn't have a lot of family outings together. Red Bastien and Billy Red Lyons were basically a tag team, but they were both in and of themselves tremendous singles wrestlers. And, compared to today, they were kind of a milquetoast babyface tag team. Nothing real flashy, although they called them the Flying Redheads, do the drop kicks and the head scissors and so forth. But they were really over huge in the AWA.
One comment, the whole one strap over the shoulder attire. Mm-hmm. I never really understood that. A lot of the guys wore trunks or they would have some type of upper but the whole, was that the Tarzan strap? Or
it looks very vaudevillian.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, absolutely vaudevillian. And a little known fact, Vern did not want to pay for the second strap. So a lot of the guys, opted just to go with the Tarzan singlet. That's good question, Joe. There you go.
Hey, just an observation.
No, absolutely. Let's keep going.
Let's show some more of the main event talent of 1970. And of course, there's my guy, the Crusher.
And again, Crusher, by 1970, Crusher had been in the Twin Cities to Minneapolis territory for about 13, 14 years already, going back to the days when he was part of the Lasowski's tag team. Crusher, of course, came back to the AWA after an absence from about 1961, 62. Crusher came back full-fledged heel, and he was challenging Vern Gagne for the championship. By 1970, of course, Crusher was 5 years into being the leading babyface, bar none, in the AWA. To say that he was Hulk Hogan before Hulk Hogan is an understatement. Whenever heels were running rampant in the AWA, the call would always go out to Crusher. Whether he was going to wrestle a Killer Kowalski or a Mad Dog Vachon or whoever, throw dog food at him, throw vegetables at him, hit him, put him in a trash can, as he did with Mitsu Arakawa in the 1960s. Crusher was the guy. And I would argue, going back in the annals of the AWA, he is, even over Vern Gagne, he is the single most popular babyface in AWA history.
Well, I'm not going to argue that point, but I got to ask a question, Mick. Something that I was thinking about when you talked about how long Crusher had been in the AWA or in the Twin Cities territory. Yeah. So we're talking about 1970, and you said Crusher had been here for about 13 years, which, simple math for most people anyway, puts us back to 1957.
Yes.
Now, the AWA didn't start, was it May of 60?
It was, well, the AWA itself, I think, officially launched in August of 1960, but it was the Minneapolis territory.
Okay.
When Crusher was here in the 50s, part of the NWA.
So, part of the NWA.
Yes.
So were shows run as frequently as it became with the AWA, which I'm thinking or guessing was monthly, or was it quarterly? What were they doing before, as far as frequency? What was wrestling doing in the Twin Cities territory before the AWA launched?
Weekly.
They
were running shows weekly, Joe. They would run Minneapolis one week, St. Paul the next week. It was pretty consistent that they would run 4 times a month. In Minneapolis, they would run at the Minneapolis Auditorium, sometimes the Minneapolis Armory. And then, of course, it was the St. Paul Auditorium. Wally Carbo promoted in Minneapolis. Eddie Williams was at least the figurehead promoter in St. Paul. But yeah, I mean, I got a stack of hundreds of programs from that era, and it was, once a week. And they would start the shows at about 8:30 at night on a Tuesday night, of all things. And they were doing extremely well for a long time. That was the regular AWA routine.
My initial reaction was of surprise, but then if I take a step back and think about it, wrestling today is a weekly television show.
Right.
So really the only difference to the AWA back in those days was that it was just a live wrestling show, but not a weekly television show. So I guess sort of makes sense in a way, but that sounds like an awful lot of work.
It really was. And the other thing that I would say to that, of course, not every card was drawing 7,000-8,000 people at that point. It would be your death match, your blow-off match that would pop the house. But, typically 3,000 to 4,000 a week. And you got to remember, too, at least in Minneapolis, and we refer to that because that's our home base, Minneapolis-St. Paul had no major league sports to compete with the AWA, in the late 1950s. They were still minor league baseball. They had minor league hockey. They did not have a football team. That all changed, of course, in 1960, 61. But the professional wrestling had a hold on the territory, no question about it.
Okay, and I apologize for digressing and going off of 1970, but it just sort of popped into my head as we're doing this. So let's get back to the main eventers during the year of 1970.
There is Cowboy Bill Watts. And Bill Watts was a babyface in the AWA, big man, Bill at about 6'5", 300 pounds. Started his career as a babyface, then turned heel a little bit, worked with Bruno Sammartino out in the East Coast. Here in the AWA area, he was huge in singles and tag team matches, consistent main eventer, and had some matches with Vern. He didn't win the championship, but that was one of those cases where Vern was the subtle heel, not an over-the-top heel. But Bill Watts, or you see some other people that would challenge Vern, come in as a babyface, and maybe people thought, hey, I want to see a new champion here. So subtly, Vern was the heel, and Vern would maybe get upset in a match and get disqualified, accidentally throw a guy over the top rope or whatever. But Bill Watts, definitely a mainstay, and no question about it. A big-time player in the history of wrestling, old school guy to a fault. You didn't fuck around with Bill Watts, and consistent.
I chuckle when you say, Vern might have thrown a guy over the top rope to get disqualified. Fast forward to wrestling today, and you've got guys launching themselves over the top rope to land on a group of wrestlers outside of the ring. It's like,
who just happen to be standing there with their arms out,
Yeah, and not just move out of the way, but that's a whole nother story. Let's move on to the next one. Who do we have next, Chris, for the year 1970 and our main event talent?
Let's take a look. Where is he? Did we look? Oh no!
No, I'm here. I wanted to let you know I'm here. I'm just I'm looking at it here. There it is. There it is. I had to look for the L.
There we go. There you go. 1970. They had already come into the AWA area. As a matter of fact, this was the team, at least the guy in the black hat, that sent Dr. X packing in 1970. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But there he is, not the brain yet. He is gorgeous Bobby Heenan. In the Chicago area, he was Pretty Boy Heenan. Apparently, they didn't want him to do that in Minneapolis because we had Pretty Boy Larry Hennig. But Bobby Heenan and Blackjack Lanza, 1970, tearing up the AWA. Bobby was not on the level that he was when he eventually managed Nick Bockwinkel, but he was still the same devious weasel back then and interfering in Blackjack's matches. But I absolutely loved this combination of Heenan and Lanza.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but have we talked with Bobby Heenan's daughter about possibly doing the podcast?
We have reached out to her, and I think that is going to be done. At a certain point, she's appearing on other podcasts. Well, damn it, if you're on other ones, you're going to be on the AWA one, Jessica. So we will get to her at a certain point.
Yeah, she is on. She is definitely on the list of people. And again, it's all been because of schedules. So
wrestling royalty.
Yes, and by the way, sorry about the delay in the picture. I put it in the chat. I get caught up listening to you guys at times, and that's why these kind of these year in reviews they're fun for me as well, because I get to hear you guys talk about something that I have no idea. You're giving context to the conversation, and I got caught up just listening to you guys. So that's
great. Well, I appreciate.
I mean, it's such a history lesson, you guys. When you guys are just like sitting there just chit chatting about things. So yeah, that was my fault. I got caught up being a mark.
Well, that's a better explanation than falling asleep because we're boring as hell. So I'll take it.
Or my Ethernet.
Well, there's that too. So with that, let's get to the next pick.
Who else is coming up here? Drum roll. Let's see who's being.
Just start. We got, as I'm looking at our list, we've got quite a few. So you can just start rattling these off here, Chris.
There you have them. Look at that tag team. That is Larry Heenan, a.k.a. Luscious Lars Anderson, and, of course, Pretty Boy Larry Hennig. And what's interesting about this tag team, and they were tearing up the AWA area in 1970. Larry was 4 years away from his electric babyface turn, saving the high flyers on television. Lars Anderson, Larry Heenan had a reputation through training camp. We've talked about this before. He was a tough guy, and Paul Pershman, Buddy Rose, told some horror stories about how he was treated by Larry Heenan as he was trying to break into the wrestling business. Larry Hennig and Lars Anderson, their catchphrase was that they had the secret. The secret was going to propel them to the AWA Tag Team Championship. Joe and Chris, I don't know if the secret was ever let out, but it never happened.
Was it Jarrah-Speed?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that would certainly do something to you. Dynapower or Jarrah-Speed.
That's my best guess.
Hennig and Anderson, they had the secret, but they never had the Tag Team Championship. But very, very devastating tag team combination. Two native Minnesotans, two legit tough guys.
I love that angle because, and I don't recall hearing it since then, the secret, but you never divulge what that secret is, just leave people hanging.
Yeah. That's right.
Well,
and obviously the secret itself, just whatever it was, wasn't good enough.
All right. What do we got next, Chris?
Pepper Gomez. Pepper Gomez was doing the stomach muscle gimmick before, about the same time Reggie Parks. Pepper was hugely popular, not only here, but in the San Francisco area. For many, many years, he was a mainstay in Chicago for Bob Luce and into Indiana. He teamed up with various tag team partners and as a singles wrestler, and he was always part of the mix for main event competition in the AWA, both singles and tag team. Great wrestler, and again, I think Pepper's legacy in this business is more on the West Coast than it was in the AWA, but he had one hell of a run.
And our next guy, I often correct the pronunciation of his first name. It's not Edward Carpentier, it's Eduardo Carpentier.
Eduardo Carpentier. And he was, if longtime wrestling fans will remember, Eduardo was not a luchador, but he was the high flyer before the high flyers in terms of he would do one move that in the middle of the match or towards the end of the match would light the fans on fire. He would have his opponent in the corner on the turnbuckle, and he would be, maybe standing on the second rope, pounding on the guy, whatever, and he would do a backflip into the middle of the ring to finish up that little sequence. Well, that went over like gangbusters back then. And I look at it now, and I'm thinking, here's a guy doing a backflip after he's punched a guy in the corner for a couple of minutes. That's nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what they're doing today. Carpentier, one of the most popular wrestlers of all time, and that is not only in the AWA, that's everywhere he went. They built him out of France. I believe he was French Canadian. But Eduardo, again, from the 1950s on, this guy was big time stuff. And he's another one of those baby faces, Joe, that had a shot at Vern Gagne in the AWA, came up short. But again, Vern played the subtle heel.
You talk about his backflip off of the top rope. I actually have a video clip of him doing that. It was in a smaller venue, smaller high school gymnasium. He did the backflip and he ended up kicking the overhead light as he landed it perfectly, but all of a sudden you had the light, the glass from the bulb breaking and falling down. For its day, rather remarkable to say the least.
And a recognized world champion in his own right. Tremendous competitor.
Yeah. And moving on, we got quite a few more here.
There you go. I mentioned the Japanese AWA connection in 1970. That is our buddy Stan Crusher Kowalski, who by that point was kind of winding down his wrestling career. He wasn't the main event caliber Stan Kowalski that he was back in the day. And with him is Shozo Strong Kobayashi. And Kobayashi is the guy that came over from Japan in 1970. And Stan brought him in. I remember Stan would always say, I traveled 17,000 miles to bring back a killer. And that's what he did. Kobe wrestled Vern in Japan, wrestled him here in the United States at the Minneapolis Auditorium. Did not win the championship, but this, as I said, the AWA's relationship with Japan back at that point was big. Kobayashi is one of those guys. When Billy Robinson debuted in the AWA in 1971, Kobayashi was still a big deal here. And Billy Robinson appeared on AWA television and beat Kobayashi, which, of course, major upset. My God, everybody, who the hell is this Billy Robinson guy? And, beating Kobe at the time was a big deal. But Kobayashi was one of the first legitimate Japanese guys that came over to the States in wrestling. We had Hawaiians and Filipinos wrestling as Japanese in the 50s and the early 60s, but Kobe was the real deal.
I feel like most wrestling fans know who Kobayashi is. Where would you put him in terms of the all-time Japanese wrestlers, in terms of the notoriety with fans over here?
Over here, there were guys that had a lot more notoriety over here.
Okay,
like Antonio Inoki.
Sure. I mean, Inoki obviously, but would you put him maybe top 5, maybe historically, or is that just not? Am I just giving him too much credit? Because
no, I don't think you are.
Okay, because to me, Kobayashi was a big deal, and I didn't even really know, but just knowing the historical context.
In Japan, he was massive, but when he came over to the United States, again, because this was kind of a new deal to have an association with the AWA and Japanese wrestling, he was kind of a relative unknown. He was like a foreign menace. He wasn't the god that he was in Japan.
Okay.
And another thing to keep in mind, Chris, this was still a time period of piggybacking off of World War II yet. Yeah. So, you had the hated Germans with Baron von Raschke and Horst Hoffman. You had the hated Japanese wrestler in Kobayashi. So it's amazing. So 1970, World War II ended in 1945. 25 years later, still working off of the whole angle of World War II.
That's wrestling fans.
Yeah.
Yep.
And maybe I'm just looking at it from a younger perspective. Whereas just when I started my fandom, I mean, Kobayashi, I guess, a lot of people, the Gen Xers, I guess we know we're like Kobayashi was a big deal, but maybe just back then it just kind of took time for that reputation and for him to really get over with a lot of us younger fans, maybe.
Well, yeah. And the American market again.
Yeah, that's true.
He wasn't just big here in the AWA. He wrestled elsewhere, but again, in Japan, a whole other ballgame. He was massive.
Yep. Okay, what do we have next?
I believe this is the next one we've got labeled here, guys.
There we are. We talked about these guys on a previous podcast, the Chain Gang. And these are the guys, and of course, that's Don Fargo on the right. These were the guys that got into a very unfortunate set of circumstances. I'm told it was actually in Iowa that they went into a bar and they got shot up, and one had to retire forever. as a result of his injuries. They played the Chain Gang. They played the Hells Angels gimmick, more so in the Chicago and Indianapolis area. But they had a run here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, wrestling some of the babyface tag teams of the era, and they got over. They were a no-nonsense tag team, pushing the envelope again, would come into the ring with the Hells Angels. They had swastikas on their jackets. So it was the real thing. But eventually it caught up with them, and, you're going to piss off the wrong group of people sometimes. And that's what happened with the Chain Gang. They were beat up by a group of Hells Angels.
You're serious? They were wearing swastikas?
Yeah. They would have a little swastika on the lapel. Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. I initially I felt sorry for him, but anyway, we shall move on.
Yes.
Moving on to our next 1970s main eventer.
This is what happens when you have Taco Bell before you wrestle. That actually is Crazy Luke Graham. And Luke Graham was one of these guys that came into the AWA area as a heel, was not here all that long, but got himself into the main event mix. Luke Graham was the kayfabe brother of Eddie Graham and Dr. Jerry Graham. None of them are brothers. None of them are Grahams. And but Crazy Luke had this persona. He would not only in the ring, but also in the interview area. He'd be talking, and all of a sudden he'd be distracted, and he's looking for birds or something that were flying over his head, and he would swat at flies that weren't there. That's where he got the name Crazy Luke. Needless to say, he was one of these guys, the bizarre characters, out of control type. Nothing scientific about this guy in the ring. But in wrestling, Crazy Luke Graham absolutely carved a niche, not only here, but everywhere he went. Yep. Crazy Joe Chupik. Oh, look at this. Look at this. They're all gone now. Yeah, there they go.
You call me crazy?
Wow.
All right,
Yeah,
moving on. Who do we have next?
I'm in good company. Let's who do we got up next?
Sorry, I got to put the picture up.
Here you go. Those of you who remember the Paul Diamond who teamed up with Pat Tanaka in the AWA area, this was the original Paul Diamond.
That was Paul Cubic Zirconium. This is Paul Diamond.
And you know what's interesting about that is that Nick Bockwinkel, who was feuding with Paul Diamond, called him the Human Zircon.
Oh, really? I had no idea.
Yeah, he absolutely did. Paul was he was a scientific wrestler, obviously good-looking guy, tremendous hit with the ladies. Came in the late 60s or into the early 70s. Outside of Bullinski, Paul Diamond was Nick Bockwinkel's first real claim to fame in the AWA. They did an angle where Nick injured Paul Diamond's leg. Diamond is out on an interview with Marty O'Neill, and he's explaining the leg injury, and he's on crutches. And Nick comes into the interview area and says, "Mr. Diamond, would you mind if I stood next to you for this interview opportunity?" And Nick kicked the leg out, and Paul Diamond disappeared from the TV screen. The crutch went falling down, and so did Paul Diamond. But Paul was, again, he was in that mix with all the baby faces and the heels in the AWA area. Main evented a few times. Not a regular main eventer, but a solid mid-card guy nonetheless.
Where was Paul from?
Paul, God, I don't recall where they billed him from. Gosh, I should know that. But nonetheless,
We'll look it up and
yeah, and I don't know if Paul is still with us. I saw him the first time I went out to Cauliflower Alley, but that was 25 years ago. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, think about it. 1970, 55 years ago.
Oh.
Yeah, no shit.
All right.
Okay.
Continuing on.
Take a breath, recoup. I'm still alive. And our next man, the Belt Master, the man with the cast iron stomach.
Reggie Parks had come into the AWA area in 1964, I believe, is when he debuted. That was probably his peak in the AWA. He had some matches with Vern Gagne, feuded with Moose Cholak, feuded with the Vachons. And as you said, Joe, Reggie's claim to fame, the cast iron stomach, letting that Volkswagen bus run across his abdominal muscles. Truth be told, and you can tell by this picture, Reggie was in phenomenal condition, always. And going up to, years ago at Cauliflower Alley when Reggie was in advanced years, he was still in tremendous condition. Reggie was also Canadian, but for some reason, they decided to bill him out of Melbourne, Australia. Why? I don't know. They needed an Aussie on their roster, I guess, and Reggie was the guy. But tremendously popular. Teamed up with Doug Gilbert in the Omaha area, Midwest Tag Team Champions back in the day. Great guy. Nothing but respect from all his peers for Reggie Parks.
Gotta say, I'm a bit envious. Look at that chin on him. He's got that Jay Leno whole jawline thing going, and
Well, yeah.
I got more chin than a Chinese phone book.
Yeah, you and Reggie and Sergeant Slaughter. And,
another one, yeah.
And Jay Leno, yeah, you're absolutely right.
I'm in great company. I love it.
Yeah. The tag team known as Chin Up, ladies and gentlemen, wrestling circles. All right,
let's hop into the cab of a big old 18-wheeler and let's bring up our next photo.
Where is he?
Not exactly the most accomplished wrestler, but I loved the gimmick. Bullinski.
Frank Shields, who wrestled as the Boston Wrecker. He also wrestled as Bruiser Frank Shields, a Bad Boy Shields. When he came into the AWA, the initial idea was to have him come in as a heel and feud with the Crusher. They changed their mind at the last minute and decided to make Bull a babyface. He came in as Bad Boy Bullinski. Somewhere along the way, he dropped the Bad Boy and became the Bull. As you said, not the most accomplished technical wrestler. He came in under the gimmick that there was a trucker strike. He was an out-of-work trucker, and he was picking up a few extra bucks by getting into fights in the wrestling ring. That was the gimmick. He was over, very popular until about 1971 when he wrestled Nick Bockwinkel on television, lost the match, and that kind of began a downward spiral for Bull Bullinski. But you mentioned him in the AWA, and he's one that people remember, no doubt.
And to me, really, it was because of his just signature catch line, Bullinski.
Absolutely. That was about his best move, by the way, Joe. That was the extent of his arsenal, Bull Bullinski. All right, who's next?
Going from Bullinski to somebody who actually could work extremely well in the ring, Dr. X.
This is what's interesting about Dr. X, and we're going to talk more about his exit from the Twin Cities area in late 1970. The Doc was still a heel in 70. He still had the caveat that if you beat him in 2 out of 3 falls, pinfall or submission, not disqualification, that didn't count, he would take the mask off. He had been here for a long time, came here in 1967, attacked Vern Gagne on TV. He was still here in 70. They turned Dr. X babyface towards the end of the summer, 1970, and he had a feud with Blackjack Lanza. Here in the Twin Cities area, the Doc took his own mask off to get into the ring, allegedly to get a match with Blackjack Lanza. August 29th, 1970. Took his own mask off. He was revealed as Dick Beyer, which in fact he was. He lost the match to Heenan and Lanza and went on an extended tour around the world and into Japan as the Destroyer, his alter ego. The interesting thing about it is I'm guessing they did this as a test run. A couple of times before he took the mask off in St. Paul, he was unmasked in matches in spot shows against Blackjack Lanza, and he was revealed as Bruce Marshall. Why they did that, I don't know. Again, test case. But when he eventually unmasked himself in St. Paul, which was going to be the big send off, he was revealed as Dick Beyer.
Bruce Marshall, wasn't he the weatherman that said it was raining in Miami? I don't know. Well,
could have been.
Could have been. And let's get on to our last main event picture before we move on to our next little segment here. This guy I think everybody will recognize.
There's a guy. I think I know him. That is pretty much the way Mr. Bockwinkel looked when he came into the AWA territory in 1970. And he came in late 1970. He had come from Georgia. He had traded the Georgia heavyweight title with Buddy Colt, then came up to the AWA. I can't imagine that when he came up here, he and Vern had anything that would resemble a 15-year deal. But Nick was over immediately as a heel. He came out with those $1 million words. He came out saying, he had come from Hawaii, he said. And in Hawaii, when somebody is leaving, we say aloha. Well, aloha, Vern Gagne, because you're not going to be champion for very long. The rest is history. But again, when Nick came in, he came in kind of slowly, built his way up where he had a winning streak, a mile long with mid-card guys, and eventually got into main event status. And the rest is history. What can you say?
So by this time in 1970, Nick had already had his starring guest role on The Monkees and also was on Hollywood Squares. Was that
Yes.
all before his run in the AWA?
Yeah, that was 1960s. Nick had wrestled extensively out in the West Coast, around the West Coast, in the San Francisco and Los Angeles and that territory. So, he had the Hollywood good looks about him, and he was eloquent. And so he got these. They weren't starring roles, no doubt, but they were kind of bit parts. Yeah, as you said, in the Monkees, and he was also on Hawaii 5-0, and of course had a guest appearance on Hollywood Squares. So Nick had that in his background, in his resume, before he came to the AWA.
So 1970, Nick comes to the AWA, has I don't know if an immediate impact is the right way to say it, but he had started his run in the AWA. When was it when the impact propelled him to championship matches and the real run against the Vern Gagne?
Well, let me say this first about some of the guys that he beat early on. It would start slow. It was the Billy Red Clouds of the world who, had a name in the AWA, not necessarily main event status anymore. Wilbur Snyder, Ed Carpentier, that type. I think when Nick hit his stride, I had mentioned the Paul Diamond situation on television. I had mentioned the Bullinski incident on television where Nick came across as this arrogant, smug heel, and he was doing dastardly stuff to these established AWA baby faces. Going into 1971, this is when things really turned, because Nick he's getting on this roll, and he's, mentioning, Vern Gagne's got his track shoes on, and quit hiding your head in the sand. He's the ostrich of wrestling, Vern Gagne, because he won't give me a title shot. When Hercules Cortez was killed in July of 1971, he had wrestled Nick that night, the night before he died, in Winnipeg. And he was going to wrestle Nick the very next night in Minneapolis. And Hercules, unfortunately, was killed in a car accident coming back from Winnipeg. Red Bastien, a passenger in the car. They put Nick in the ring with Vern Gagne. This was a non-title match, obviously. This is the way they build it, because Vern had no opportunity to get ready for the match. This was also the debut of Ray Stevens that very same night, and Ray interfered in the match, and that enabled Nick to go over on Vern Gagne in this non-title match in 1971. So it did two things: establish Nick as the real deal, and the connection with Ray Stevens.
Wow. I remember that, but I guess I never really thought about how the unfortunate death of Hercules Cortez was sort of the catalyst of Nick going over.
Yeah,
Getting over.
So do you know, was the Ray Stevens thing, was that planned, or was that all part of, I assume based on what you're telling me, that was all part of the pivot?
I think bringing in Ray to team with Nick was planned.
This was just the catalyst.
Yeah, this was the
Okay.
catalyst. It's all of a sudden, Nick is in the ring with Vern, and how, Vern's not going to lose clean to anybody. The same thing when he lost the title to Nick in '75. Bobby Duncombe interfered. Vern's not going to put anybody over clean. But yeah, this was absolutely the catalyst, and Nick and Ray had known each other from the West Coast, and this was a natural deal. But this is, they got a jump start. Let's put it that way. Yeah. There you go.
Wow.
So, Mick, we've gone over a lot of the main event talent, a lot of the big names, but like in any time period, let's go to the other side. Let's talk about some of the, shall we call them, up and coming stars in professional wrestling during 1970.
That big guy right there, that good-looking Hollywood guy, eventually became a boogeyman, boogie woogie man. That is Jimmy Valiant, Handsome Jimmy. In actually late 60s into 1970 AWA, he was here as Jim Valen, Valen. Didn't accomplish very much. Mid-card guy, gave a good accounting of himself, but never part of the main event mix, and then left the territory, and of course became part of the Valiant brothers along with John Sullivan, Johnny Valiant, and then of course his run as Boogie Woogie Man. So I guess effectively you could say, yeah, the AWA again was a launching pad for a future superstar in Jim Valen, Jimmy Valiant.
We could put that onto so many different names. It's, we could spend 6 months worth of shows going over them. Another guy who sort of did all right for himself, but started here.
That would be Big Bob Windham. And Big Bob Windham was trained, of course, part of that, Vern Gagne early training camp. Big guy, babyface when he came in. Big Bob Windham, of course, became Blackjack Mulligan. And I think in the history of professional wrestling, Joe and Chris, you'd have to agree with this, probably one of the top, at least top 30 guys in the history of the business in terms of the impact that he made everywhere he went. His AWA run early on was very short. Then he left the area. Blackjack Mulligan was big in Chicago and for Dick the Bruiser. Not so much here in the Twin Cities area until he came back. Later on, when Blackjack Lanza turned babyface and came in Mulligan kind of towards the end of his run. But again, a rookie of the year is the trophy that he's holding there, Bob Windham.
And for those that are curious, you hear the Windham name. He might have had some offspring that did all right for themselves as well.
Not too shabby. He did extremely well, tremendous legacy in the business. You look at pictures of Blackjack Mulligan towards the end of his life, and yeah, it was sad. He had ballooned to probably close to 350, 400 pounds, wasn't doing very well, but nonetheless, boy, what an impact he had on the business.
Yeah, Barry Windham, Kendall Windham, second generation wrestlers. And our last up-and-coming wrestler of the time is?
This is Buddy Smith. I'll wait for the applause to die down. Buddy Smith was a kind of your milquetoast, mid-card, babyface, occasional enhancement guy on AWA television, worked around the horn in 1970. His big break came when he went down to the Florida area and magically transformed himself into Buddy Roberts. Freebird Buddy Roberts teaming up with Michael Hayes, and then Jimmy Garvin. The rest, of course, is history. But there he's Buddy Smith. Good old Buddy Smith here in the AWA area.
Just as a slight aside, knowing, being in the business or around the business as long as I have, I've come to appreciate the indies for this reason. There really weren't indies back in the day. It was just another wrestling organization. So you had guys like Buddy Roberts or Bob Smith or the Jimmy Vallens of the world. Go to your local indie shows, support the guys. Remember what these guys look like, because it's a very good possibility that they're going to make the big stage someday. Obviously not all of them, but they're going to make that big stage, and you're going to be able to look back and say, hey, I remember when, for example, CM Punk used to wrestle at the West St. Paul Armory, in front of a couple of hundred people, and now take a look at what he was. You're really able to, in some, I'm not going to even say many, but in some instances, you're going to see the superstars of tomorrow. Everybody's got to start someplace.
Great point, Joe. And I think a couple of things. First of all, this illustrates what Vern Gagne did. The guys that he trained into the business that eventually became stars, whether or not it was after they left here is irrelevant. I'm thinking of a guy named Ric Flair, for example. Yeah. Bob Remus, Sergeant Slaughter. These guys did tremendously well. And to your point about the indies, look at Sean Waltman. Sean Waltman's wrestling in front of 250 people at George's in Fridley. And then all of a sudden he's on to the Global Wrestling Federation. Then all of a sudden he's on to WWF. It's Ken Anderson. Ken Anderson, a local guy working at the West St. Paul Armory. All of a sudden he's Mr. Kennedy and then Mr. Anderson. So yeah, it still happens. I think the difference today, Joe, is that where these guys can go, the options are much more limited than they were back in the day. Now you maybe go to 3 or 4 different places. Back then you could maybe go to Florida. You could go to Memphis. You could go to Georgia. You could go to Portland, wherever. So in that sense, yeah, the door is a little bit closer to being shut than it was before. But great point. Go out and see these. Arya Davari, another guy. Sean Davari. I mean, these are guys that all start on the local level. Like you said, they got to start somewhere. And you might be seeing the next superstar, no doubt.
Yeah, on the flip side of that, the landscape is completely different than it was in 1970 or even into the 80s, and dare I say even into the 90s. But the wrestlers today, it's a different opportunity, but they're still afforded more of an opportunity because you've got the NWAs of the world, the TNAs of the world, the AEWs of the world. So there's more stages to be able to shine on. It's just a totally different animal than it was back in the day.
Great point. And to that point, different animal in terms of these are groups that have television exposure, national television exposure. Back in the day, you went to Florida Championship Wrestling, for example, localized. Georgia Championship Wrestling before they went national, localized promotion. Same with Portland. They all had their local TV, but you didn't have the national spotlight. Yep. So while the opportunities are more limited, the light is shining much, much brighter than it did back then.
Yep. So let's get back as I digress, and my wife always laughs at me because I do that quite a bit. But let's get back to 1970. Let's talk about some of the notable feuds and or storylines of the year.
I mentioned at the outset that there were no championship changes in 1970. So it wasn't this hot potato that you got going on right now, let alone the number of championships, intercontinental and this and that and the other thing. There wasn't even an AWA light. Well, I guess Danny Hodge early on, but it was very limited. So you were basing your shows on feuds. And I would say going back to 70, the feuds that Billy Red Lions and Red Bastien had with the Vachon brothers was one of the major feuds. Of course, the Vachons working against the Crusher was a major feud ongoing for years and years before and after. But there were no championship changes. You think of a Kobayashi coming into town from Japan. Yeah, you got this worldwide recognition, but no championship change. And it wasn't even really a feud with Vern and Kobayashi. It was more Stan Kowalski bringing in a guy from overseas to get even with Vern Gagne for all Stan's animosities towards Vern. But the feuds were red hot and they were violent. You're going back to the era when the Crusher cut up Mad Dog Vachon on television. There wasn't a main event, hardly a main event, where the Vachons and the Crusher and whoever else, where there wasn't blood spilled. Bobby Heenan, Blackjack Lanza. So the feuds were red hot. You didn't need a championship to make money at the box office. Let's put it that way.
What would be your favorite angle of that year?
Wow. I don't know if it was my favorite angle. I think the most impactful thing for me was the Dr. X situation. Because he had been here for, as I said, the summer of 1967. Now you're into the fall of 70, and they're turning him babyface, and they're turning him in such a way where he is kind of alienating himself from his old tag team partners like Jack Lanza, like Larry Hennig. And this was amazing. And the build up to Dr. X taking his mask off in St. Paul was monumental. Nobody had been able to take this guy's mask off for 3 years. And here you go. August 29th of 1970. Dr. X, and by the way, yes, he autographed it for me, one of my absolute treasures in my collection, in St. Paul. Dr. X has said, in order for the AWA to give me a chance to get Bobby Heenan and Blackjack Lanza back in the ring, I'm going to get in the ring and I'm going to take my own mask off. Nobody has been able to do it all this time. Nobody is going to be able to do it. So I'm going to do it myself. And he said, not only will I unmask prior to the match, but I will draw blood from both Heenan and Lanza before the night is over. On the trifecta, he did all three. He took the mask off, as introduced by Marty O'Neill as Dick Beyer, and he drew blood from Lanza and Heenan. Lost the match, unfortunately, but that started his world tour. And when he came back in 1972, full-fledged babyface.
So here's my question about being announced as Dick Beyer from somebody else. Would it have made more sense for him to say, my name is Dick Beyer? Because then that gives you the impression that, hey, other people knew who he was.
I don't.
Or maybe I'm just reading into it.
What I will say is that when Marty O'Neill, it was kind of dramatic the way they did it, because Marty is saying, here's a man, he is offered to take his mask off, and his ex is taking the mask off. Marty is introducing him as a former football coach at Syracuse University, blah, 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 Dick Beyer, and a smattering of applause on two counts. Number one, the fans hadn't heard of Dick Beyer.
Right.
For the most part. He had been wrestling as a destroyer prior to coming here. And the other thing is, when Dick took his mask off, this is not a Hollywood movie star that you're looking at in Dick Beyer. He had the bald head, he had kind of a rugged, been around the block 15, 20 times look about him. So the fans are kind of like, okay. One thing I will say, he wrestled without the mask, but towards the end of the match, he went underneath the ring, got another mask, and came out from the other side of the ring, and then he drew the blood from Heenan and Lanza, and what a massive pop when he came back with another mask. Wait, it's just a great night. Great night all the way around.
Awesome. Is there a place we can find that video? Probably not.
God.
No.
They didn't keep enough of that old footage, unfortunately.
Ugh.
And it's interesting too. I mentioned the Bruce Marshall situation earlier on, and I'm guessing again that was a test case, to see how it would go over. But then you think of a guy like Bob Remus. Bob Remus had appeared in the AWA as Bob Remus early on, and when he's unmasked as Super Destroyer Mark II, he's unmasked as Matthew Burns. Matt Burns.
Wasn't that the guy in The Simpsons, the boss?
Montgomery.
Oh, Montgomery. Sorry.
Yeah, this was Matt Burns, and even in public, Lord Alfred Hayes, God bless him, keeping kayfabe, would say, "Matthew, come over here, Matthew." Yeah.
So,
oh boy.
Oh, sorry.
I got to share a memory that I have of Dr. X back in the day. My older brother Jack would practice the dreaded figure 4 leg lock on me when Dr. X was here. So in 1970, I was 5 years old. And when he applied it to me, being a 5-year-old, it, for me, reaffirmed that professional wrestling was real, because the way he applied it, it hurt like a son of a bitch. My question to you, Mick, is what was this is about 2 decades before kayfabe was broke, but what was the general feeling of the fans at the time for professional wrestling? Were there more believers or more non-believers?
Absolutely believers. And I'm not saying that there weren't non-believers. A percentage of people knew what wrestling was. But it was still, again, you're long before kayfabe. And there was always this shred of doubt, even with the believers. Yeah, well, wait, how did he do that or whatever? You had a mystery about it. Whether or not the fans, and take a look at this. What a great way to finish up our pictures here. A steel cage match with Crusher and Bruiser against the Vachons. This is why people still believed. And when Mad Dog split himself open on television, this is why people still believed. You look at how many riots there were around the AWA area. You look at shootings in Chicago. You look at stabbings. People still believed wrestling was still red hot. There was nothing that looked Hollywood-ish about wrestling. There was no glitz and glamour about it. There was no pyro. There was no, nonsensical stuff. All the window dressings and trappings. It was just hard-hitting wrestling. And yeah, you had your percentage of non-believers, of course, but there was still a great number of people that believed everything they were seeing. They detested the heels and they loved the baby faces. And that's what I miss.
So many things catch my eye in this ad, but I'm going to refer specifically down to the bottom right. No TV. Obviously, it wasn't going to be live. This was before the age of pay-per-view. But going to what Chris had asked earlier about, is there footage of it? My guess is for this at Comiskey Park that they didn't even have video cameras on hand to record the matches, which, get into the 80s at the St. Paul Civic Center. Every single match or every single card was recorded. Granted, it was only one camera and you only had a play-by-play commentator, but the no TV, that just is a testament to the way professional wrestling was run back in the day. And that is the TV drove the ticket sales, and the only way that you could see what's going to happen was to go to the live event. Live events drove professional wrestling back in the day.
No question about it. And we've talked about it in the Minneapolis territory, Joe. Wrestling is on from 6 o'clock to 7:30 on a Saturday night. And the wrestling card is going to start at 8:30.
Yeah.
And you had an angle, you had something red hot at, 7:28 on a Saturday night, and Marty would come on and say, "Oh my God, ladies and gentlemen, get in your car right now, get down to the air-cooled Minneapolis Auditorium, not air-conditioned, air-cooled Minneapolis Auditorium, because my God, what is going to happen tonight?" And it was magic.
I'm surprised I didn't hear that magical catchphrase come out of you. Run, don't walk.
Don't walk. Run, don't walk. Oh, it was just a brilliant, brilliant formula. Never be the same. Never be the same.
No, of course not. And so with that, Mick, where for you, where would you rank the year 1970 in the annals of AWA history? So just to clarify that, we're talking about, I'll include 1960 through, and sort of on the flip side of that, I'm going to shake my head, 1991. So in that 31 years, where would you rank 1970 in terms of AWA significance?
I don't think you can rank it by itself. I think you have to say 70, 71, 72, 73, maybe even to 74. The early 70s. Let's put it that way, Joe. I said that there were no championship changes in 1970. It was based on the feuds. You had a couple of changes going forward in 71, 72. But I would say in terms of the volatility of the feuds, the greatness of television and what they would do for an angle, red hot stuff. To me, the 1970s, it's almost my favorite era in wrestling. And of course, from a bias standpoint, having Nick come in 1970 kind of changed the whole landscape for me. But I would say in terms of believability, credibility, and overall impact at the shows themselves with what they were presenting, stellar.
So before we get out to the shout outs, got a question for you about you and Nick. You said Nick came in 1970. When did you develop or create the Bockwinkel Brigade? How soon after Nick got here before you, shall we say, completely marked out for him?
I marked out for him a long time before I met him. I loved the persona. It was a totally different type of heel. I met Nick on June 12th of 1971, Joe. I've got the date etched in my head. I met him at the TV studio, and this is 1 week after we held up a sign at the Minneapolis Auditorium extolling Nick's virtues. Nick is number one, and the ushers tore it down. They tore it down because people were complaining. In this day and age, if you don't have a sign with you, they kick you out of the building. But I was real sheepish. I approached Nick afterward, and Nick had seen the sign because he pointed to it and gave us like the peace sign. And I said, "Remember that guy?" "Oh, yeah, you're the guys. I remember." I said, "Nick, they tore the sign down." That was his response. And 10 minutes after that, Nick signed the permission slip to run the Bockwinkel Brigade, and Buddy Rose, Paul Pershman's name is on that original slip. I've still got it. But yeah, it was, so it took probably about 6-8 months, at least before I met Nick, but I was always a fan.
So going into that meeting with Nick, that first time, like talking with him, you had already developed the concept for the Bockwinkel Brigade?
Not necessarily. I had been a fan club guy early on. When I was 14, I ran a fan club for the Crusher. I put out newsletters with a homemade mimeograph machine. And again, I told this story. Nick was not the first guy I approached. Bobby Heenan was. at the Dykeman Hotel lobby, and I said, Bobby, I want to run a fan club for you. And Bobby said, get the hell out of here. Nick was actually my second choice at the time, but once we got rolling, the Bockwinkel Brigade was a different breed of cat. They knew what was going on. They were smart to the business. It was a very, very close-knit fraternity. We had a niche. So the bulletins that I started producing for the Bockwinkel Brigade treaded that fine line between kayfabe and opening up to the business. So, but Nick didn't mind it. Nick knew what we knew, and he played it pretty close to the vest, nonetheless. But yeah, so there's kind of your history, and it only lasted for till Nick retired in 1987. But in my mind, it's still going. So there you go.
I love
See,
it.
these shows are incredible when we start it and then you guys are just having this natural conversation. I just find it so fascinating and interesting as a fan, and hopefully people out there kind of approaching it the same way that I am. I'm just listening to two guys chop it up, talking about something that hopefully for some of you it'll bring back memories from when you were a kid or a younger adult, or for somebody like me, you hear these names, but you don't exactly know how to piece it together. And it just kind of chronologically puts together a timeline. And I mean, I got to say, guys, I think this was one of my favorite in terms of you guys weaving into a natural conversation, just about the current state of the business and things that happen. And then just being able to encapsulate the feeling in 1970. So, I think this has probably been one of my favorite, where I've just gotten caught up forgetting that I've got a job to do and just listening to you guys talk.
I appreciate that, Chris. I mean, I really do. And it's a history lesson for some people. For me, it's going back in time. Great memories. When Joe said 55 years ago, I could have shit my pants, because I think to myself, this guy that met Nick Bockwinkel in 1971, he was a long-haired hippie freak, still going to college. And then all these years later, here I am still talking about it. And I got to say, with our YouTube audience, what I love when we do a show like this is when somebody will say, hey, Mick, you said 1968. Well, it was really early 1969 in Iowa. I love that because, damn it, those people are still out there. And
they're passionate,
and they remember the glory days of wrestling. So, but I really appreciate what you said, Chris, and I love these throwback shows. I really do.
Yeah, and if we say something that we're off slightly time-wise, we're fans. I mean,
Right.
Mick and I have worked in this business in one way, shape, or form for decades, but we're not the authority. No, that's not a shot at our good friend George Shire. We are first and foremost, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mick, we're wrestling fans. I mean, 1970, and I got to talk with George Shire about this, but I believe 1970 was when I got hooked on professional wrestling. I believe that in May of 1970, there was a cage match between Crusher and Mad Dog at the St. Paul Auditorium. I would have been 4 years old, turning 5 at the end of May. So when I first saw that 1970 was the year, I'm like, okay, if it's not the year that I became a wrestling fan, it was pretty damn close to it. So 55 years later, you're talking, Mick, about this long-haired, freaky person going to college, still talking about it 55 years later. I feel the same way. I'm that little Polish kid going to the wrestling matches with his mom and his godmother, who staunchly and firmly believed in the business. Fast forward 15 years past 1970, I worked for the AWA, and now for the last 40 years, I've been involved in the business some way, shape, or form, and now here I am talking about the AWA, and the most not surprising, but the most gratifying thing is that there's people that are interested in what I or we have to say
Right.
about the AWA. It both amazes me and surprises me, but most of all, I just love it.
Two things before we do the shout out. Number one, Joe, yes, first and foremost, we are wrestling fans. And, even when Greg was on our show, Greg Gagne, and he was kind of giving me shit, but he said, you've always been a fan. You've always been supportive. First and foremost, I'm a wrestling fan. With all its I don't have to be happy with its incarnations. There's a lot of things about the business I just detest these days. There's no comparison back to the 1970s except for the name wrestling. But I'm a fan, I always will be a fan. And I've had enthusiasm for this business. When I can sit here and talk about the days when I was growing up or hanging out with Nick Bockwinkel, honest to God, it is just euphoric. And that will kind of lead into my personal shout out, which we'll get to in a second.
Let's get to it here, guys. Let's absolutely, Mick, you go ahead and kick it off.
My shout out is to all the members of the Bockwinkel Brigade, many of whom are sadly no longer with us. It's been a long time. But the memories that you gave me and the friendships that I forged as a result of being a Bockwinkel fan I can't overstate them. And, the George Shires and the Joyce Postians of the world and Rich Tito in Chicago and all these people that were, I look at my list of the old Bockwinkel Brigaders and I see so many are gone, but some are still here. And God bless all of you. Thanks for the memories.
My shout out is going to go to, he's an attorney by the name of William Amadeo. Hopefully I said it right. Brand new Patreon member. Loves the show so much that he decided to pay for a year in advance for his membership, which in itself, thank you very much. But another reason why I put him as the shout out, not just because he prepaid for a year, but he's in Michigan now. I don't know if he lived in AWA territory prior, but Michigan was not AWA territory. It had its own territory.
Right.
And so William, Bill, Mr. Amadeo, sorry. If you were in the grew up in an AWA territory and just love to hear our stories, thank you for being a fan and a Patreon member. If you've always lived in Michigan and just love the show to learn about the AWA, same thing. Thank you very much. So a double-headed dose of a shout out to our latest and newest Patreon member.
And by the way, if you become a Patreon member, email me at awaunleashedpodcast@gmail.com. Or if you want to even DM me, my DMs are always open on Facebook or Meta, whatever it's being called nowadays. Just let me know that you've become a Patreon member. And once I go in and check and see it, send me your email address, your physical address, and we'll make sure that you're hooked up. Because if you become a Patreon member, I want to make sure that you get everything that you are entitled to. So yeah, I don't want somebody to sign up and feel like they're not getting what they should. So let me know. And I will personally make sure that we get you set up and taken care of. Mine is Brian Worth, who's a regular contributor to our Facebook page, AWA Unleashed fans. If you're interested in, being on the social media side of it, Brian, I know you've been going through some health issues lately, so just thinking about you. I want you to know that you're on my mind. And hey, shout out to you, man. Get better, and just thank you for the support. But number one, get yourself better because you need to be around to listen to more of us, amongst other things.
Perfectly said. We got to get going, folks, because it's raining in Miami, and
the extra time. We'll put it this way: the extra time on this episode, I think, like, we sort of owe it to you for our for life happening to us. So enjoy the extra half an hour, and it's not only raining in Miami. Squirrel.
Crazy Joe. Oh.
Oh, I got 38 reasons to love the end of this show.
Aloha.